Hello, welcome to Conversations with Tim. Uh, I'm I'm grateful that you take a few minutes to spend with me as we just have conversations. The idea behind this is, uh, I deal with I was a pastor of a church. I am the president of a chamber of commerce in my community. I coach sports. I do a lot of different things. And so the idea is, instead of always me talking and answering questions or whatever it may be, I'm just going to invite some of my friends in, and we're going to have a conversation. And so the general idea is that you get to eavesdrop as I talk, and we have conversations with our friends, right? So tonight's friend is Howell Thomas. And so Hal Thomas goes and we met back in 1987, which is a lifetime ago. I don't know how we got so old, but I'm twice the man I was back then, as Hal will be more than happy to tell you about. But I had hair back then and everything, but that's a different day. And so I met Hal at my first church. Out of college, I started my first church as my senior year. I traveled back and forth, and then after college, they brought me on full time. And then that fall was when Howell came on, and he moved there. So, Adam, you're going to bring Howell in. I will introduce him to everyone. So that's my friend Howell. Now, also for those who've been around Cross Church for a long time, back when we were still called Carlinville Southern Baptist Church in our old building, when we started making our transition from in worship, I knew I was going to be hiring a staff member, and we want to transition from just doing hymns and having a piano and an organ kind of a thing to a more of a praise and worship environment. Hal's the person that I brought in to help us make that transition, and he came in multiple weeks at times, and once a month for, I don't know, was it more than a year? Wasn't it? Long time, whatever it was, long time.
Several years too.
Yeah, but as I get older, I don't age as well as you. As I get older, my memory kind of slides a little bit. But Hal spent a lot of time with us, and he was an important part of my life. And so we'll talk about that as we kind of go along the life. One of the things I remember about Howell. So you remember, I'm young. I became pastor or youth pastor of a church. We called them youth directors back then. I had just started kind of in a full-time role of that. And this guy from Buffalo, New York comes in, and he has an accent. Well, he still has an accent. He's lived here forever. So he's from Southern Indiana now, in Seymour, Indiana. And so he's lived here for a long time. So you can just imagine his accent back in the late 80s. And that was kind of different for me because, like that was okay, great. And he had some different ways about him. And one of the funny things I want to start off with is, so he's from Wales, and he came over. He doesn't know I'm going to tell the story at all, but he came over on a choir trip, I think it was, or some kind of thing like that, to New York to tour with his group. And he met a girl. Her name is Ruth. And if I remember the story correctly, and how you obviously will correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm going to give her a hint to you in a second. You guys were met, and 3 days later you had to leave town, and in that 3 days you got engaged. Is that how that story goes?
Yeah, close enough, Tim.
And I remember I was just like, what in the world? Like, I've never heard of such a thing as that. And I can't imagine the people around you and how crazy that must have been for them too. I mean, you weren't even like from the same neighborhood, or we went to high school together, or you're from a completely different country, and here's this girl from, New York, and she meets this guy, and 3 months, three days later, he's going away. And how I remember the story is, you're engaged, and when you came back like 6 months later, wherever it was, for the wedding, that was the next time you saw her. Is that correct?
Well, she did come to visit Wales for a little time in there. And it was a bit awkward because I had not told my parents. I just had told them that I'd met this young lady and she wanted to come to visit Wales. So she shows up wearing an engagement ring. So I had to ask her to take the engagement ring off when she met my parents. It just was the funny thing else also, Tim, is that nobody gave us a chance that the marriage would succeed. Most of all, her pastor in Buffalo, New York, violently opposed to the union. And here we are almost 49 years later, still going strong.
Yeah, that was really the question I was trying to get to. I mean, I knew it'd been a long time, so I just kind of want to know how long. 49 years almost, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
40 of those years in full-time ministry.
Well, I've thought about that a lot over the years. Is people do different things, and that is not what we would recommend for anybody to do. But obviously, you guys knew God brought you together, and He's blessed that. For those who don't know, and some of you, a lot of you may not know this, but there used to be a Christian band, and then became a secular band called the Elms. If you remember the Elms, the Howell and his wife Ruth, they are the parents of two of the Elms. So the lead singer and the drummer would be his children. And so if you're familiar with them, that's who they'd be. So take us from.
We did pick up another one too. When we were in Missouri, Tim.
Oh, yes, that's right. Got Tom.
Yeah. And he came a part of our family in 5th grade and moved out when he was 31.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah. Tom, I still engage Tom on Facebook. He's amazing guitarist. So take us from ever how old you were at that time. I assume you didn't know you was going to be a worship, pastor. Take us from that time, and how was it that God kind of revealed the mystery of the call He had on your life? What was kind of your journey for that?
I had an uncle who was a Baptist pastor, and he and others recognized that there was a call in my life. I preached my first message when I was 10. He told me, do not enter into ministry immediately out of college, which you did, which is fine. I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but he said you need to live a season of your life in the world, and you wait patiently and that call will come. And so trained to be a teacher, taught in Wales, taught in Buffalo, New York. And it was in August of 1980, something rather unusual happened. I would fill my big old car, we had a big old Chevy, filled it always in the same gas station. And do you remember me telling you this story?
Vaguely. I can't remember the details of it.
Yeah, must have been very important for you to remember it.
It's been a long time.
Yeah. I pulled up my car to the gas station, and I was pumping gas, and those cars held about 1,000 gallons. So it was taking a little time to fill. And I looked across the street, and that gas station is still there, and this playing field is still there, big old playing field. And on that field, there were two teams playing a game. They had a crowd watching them. They had officials. They were in their competitive, whatever you call it, uniforms, whatever you call them in this country. And I didn't recognize the game. And I wasn't surprised. I had not long been in the country, and I had never seen basketball played. I'd never seen baseball played. I'd never seen American football played. So this was a game that I figured was alien to me. And so another car pulled up, and I asked this guy, can you tell me what they're playing? I'm from another country. I've never seen that game. And he said, oh, yeah, he said, that's a European game called rugby. And I said, are you quite sure? And he said, yeah, that's rugby. And I said, well, that's a strange thing, because rugby is the national sport of Wales, and I don't recognize it. And in that moment, and you think that God will call you to something when you're in your prayer closet or in one of those moments, and I was pumping gas. And God spoke to my heart as clearly as I've ever heard him. And he said, he said, they're in the right place. They've got all the equipment they need. They've got all the clothes they need, the officials, everything they need. But you, knowing the real thing, you don't recognize it. And that is the way it is in church. I don't recognize what my children do when they gather together. Go tell them that. And it was pretty riveting. It was interesting because I was a teacher at the time. I went and I told my pastor at the time, you know the pastor. And I told him, and he said, well, he was absolutely intrigued with that. And he said, well, I want you to leave your teaching position because it was August. It was a convenient time to do it. And I want you to come into the church as a full-time staff member. And I want to walk with you through this revelation of why you heard God saying that he didn't recognize. And so in that time, I said, well, God, you've got to help me because I got no idea what I'm doing. And he said, all you have to do is read John chapter 9. Read John chapter 9 and it will be revealed to you. And I could go on now, but that's the way I was called. It was very interesting. And for 40 years until I retired last year, I've been attempting to help people understand that there is, you mentioned earlier about the fact that churches might have transitions, they might have contemporary worship, traditional worship, cowboy worship, Southern Baptist worship, whatever denominational worship. There isn't any of those. There is one expression of worship, and that's biblical worship. So we shouldn't be differentiating between these different expressions. They are different expressions of praise. And I also want to say this, that there is a fundamental difference between praise and worship. Fundamental. And I've been trying to help people understand that as well. Because when we put them together, bread and butter, horse and carriage, praise and worship, that is really a poor way to express those words. They're very, very different. We can chat about that if you want.
Yes, we will. So just with that launch, and I remember after you started that story, I remember exactly that, you talking about that. So Howell comes in. I'd already been at the church we were at for a year or so. Now part-time, when I say part-time, I was a student. So I would drive 2 hours to be there on Wednesday, 2 hours back. I'd drive 2 hours to be there on the weekend, 2 hours back. So I was only there on some Wednesdays and Sundays or Saturdays and Sundays for the school year. And then, so in the summertime, I was there full time. And so I've probably been there full time for 4 or 5 months time Howell shows up. And, if you go to 10 Cross Church, and we talk about this very often, my call in the ministry was kind of reluctant because I was, I want to look at the Bible, look at the church, see the same thing, that kind of idea. And I don't know what the word is, just, searching for lack of a better term. And, when they were doing interviews in my college and I was asked to come interview, I said no, because I, already had plans and what I was going to be doing. And it was in the fall and all that kind of stuff. And they talked me into coming and get an interview just for the experience of it. So I went and did that. I come in my sweatpants and my t-shirt, my baseball cap, and obviously wasn't trying to get a job. And I ended up getting the job. So it was kind of an odd situation how I got the job in the first place. And then Hal comes in, and it's conversations like that God used to be very transformative in my life at a very, what do you want to call it, a young age or a transformative age, what do you want to call it, very foundational who I am. If you pay attention to me as a pastor, if you watch how we function as a church, it's you've heard those kind of things come from me, or as Hal talks about those, you'll hear the role that he has played in my life, basically, the principles he taught me, the things he exposed me to, or the ways he challenged me to think, and even years afterwards, things that I found out, I walked through based on some of those principles that he had taught me. But just if all we did was end the conversation right now and go home, just that one nugget of truth right there, that so much of what the church does today is not recognized in heaven, like you didn't recognize rugby, and here was the national sport of your country. That's to me, that's profound. And we have to remember that's not about us. Worship isn't supposed to be about us. It's about extending love to God. And so while we're on that topic right there, why don't we just jump into it, and why don't you kind of begin to talk about the difference in praise and worship? Because that's one of the questions that's coming up anyway.
I've read, as you have, many, many books. And one of the things that concerns me, Tim, is that in a lot of these books with Christian leaders, I mean, real significant men, you'll see something like this written: for all intents and purposes, the soul and the spirit are one and the same. I believe that that's fundamentally wrong. I believe, very simply stated, that praise is an expression of the soul, because the soul is to have government over your physical body. And so when you praise, it's an action of the soul, and it's expressed by your body. And the expressions are numerous, and you've taught your church about that. Praise is the result of gratitude. Worship is a function of the spirit, and it's the result of relationship. Relationship between your spirit and he who is spirit. They are fundamentally different, fundamentally related, of course. But I will enter his gates with thanksgiving. I will enter his courts with praise. And I would add to that scripture, and I will enter his presence in worship. And I believe that that is one of the, I'll give you an example. I was in Fort Worth after I left Missouri, and there was a very large Southern Baptist seminary there. You know about it. Mm-hmm. And in the church that I served, there was a class which I taught for students who were going to that seminary. And I'll never forget, one Sunday morning, I threw this thing out about the fact that there is a difference between soul and spirit, and they had no clue what I was talking about. These were seminary students who didn't understand the fundamental difference between soul and spirit. And so a lot of my time in expressing to people the significance of praise and the significance of worship, I separate them. But I also, the prelude to that has to be that they understand that they're, just as God is triune, we are triune in body, soul, and spirit. And if we don't understand that, we likely will never understand the difference between praise and worship.
Yep, absolutely true. It's funny. So I came across some stuff. When I first, I moved here in March of 2000, been here 20 years. And, I taught, worship, countless times. And so I just happened to pull up something, and this is from December of 2000. So I've been here a year, 9 months or whatever it'd been. And the series was called Kingdom First. I'm not even sure what all I was talking about, but in this section, I was talking about worship. Okay. And I don't know if people will be able to see that or not, but this section right here, that enter your gates with thanksgiving, your courts with praise, and enter your presence with worship. So here, you would have taught me that in the late 80s, and I was preaching that in 2000. Isn't that funny?
That's great.
And that now to me, that's exactly right. It's a process of a lot of people, they throw those words together like they're the same thing, and they're not the same thing.
Right.
So let's kind of break them up a little bit. What would you say is let's just call it praise. What would you say is the real purpose of praise? And then we'll go, what is the real purpose of worship, or the role, or how you want to describe those?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could be here for a week, right?
Yep.
Praise is to be a lifestyle. Biblically, if you wanted to praise someone, I mean, let's say that there was a situation where they released you from a commitment to slavery or whatever, and you were profoundly grateful. If you wanted to praise a person, you had to take them into a public place to offer that praise. It had to be heard by witnesses. Otherwise, it did not count. And I think that that's very fundamental, that if we believe that our praise is to be cloistered on a Sunday morning for that half hour, hour and a half, however long it is, and it's been absent for the other 167 hours of the week, then it really doesn't impress anybody if you're going to do it for that 1 hour. I
agree. Absolutely. So then let's go to worship. What do you think the real role, purpose of worship is, if you're going to separate the two out?
I don't know that. Well, let me ask you this, Tim. How many times do you have to do something before you can describe it real accurately? If I said to you, I know that you've played baseball for years. If I said, Tim, how many times have you played baseball? And you count them up and it was 7,000 times or whatever. Can you describe it? And you'd be able to describe it really, really, really accurately. And yet, in 40 years of ministry, I would ask people, you might be 60, 70, 80 years of age. How many times have you come together and exercised this thing, which it says on the marquee outside your building, morning worship? So you've done it probably 5,000, 6,000, 10,000 times. So surely, if somebody landed on the parking lot from Mars and they said, what is morning worship? You would be able to describe it with great, great accuracy. And you know what, Tim? I have found that people fail to describe the essence of worship. And I'm not going to even attempt to do that. Because if it doesn't start back, I will enter his gates with thanksgiving, then there isn't going to be legitimate praise. And if there isn't extravagant, heartfelt, genuine praise, you're not going to experience worship.
I agree.
So my challenge to people is experience praise in its biblical fullness and let worship take care of itself.
Again, that's very profound. My definition, when I try to help people understand from a definition perspective, the difference in the words, like you said, praise is out of gratitude and it's celebration, all those kind of things. And the words we use in praise, todah and yada and all those kind of words. And worship is the extension of love to God. And I think it's like people really struggle. They have favorite songs. They think worship was really good today because the message was good, or because the right songs were played in the right key. I remember one time, remember back in the old days when it was I Exalt Thee was the song, and I don't remember, I was a dumb kid. Whatever. Things that I got by with that, God gave me grace and people gave me grace and, whatever. But I'm just remember being on the front row of church. It'd been me and you, I sat on the front row of church. I wasn't even going to preach that Sunday. There was someone else going to preach that Sunday. And I Exalt Thee was the song that we came on, and everybody sang the song. And then the I Exalt Thee part, all the hands went in the air. And I was just so grieved by that. and it wasn't really me. It's just I had to get up and express how I felt about that. And I talked about it and expressed, what I thought about that. And over the years, I remember that, and there's so many times I think that we, like you said, we don't, because we don't go through the process correctly, we never really experience biblical worship. We say we love God. Like, I don't know if you ever seen me draw my learning to enjoy God cycle out, but we seek God, we know God, we love God, we enjoy God. And everybody says they love God, but they don't know him. And the reason they don't know him is because they don't love him or they don't seek him. And you can't, so there's no way we can experience real worship if there's not real love taking place, that's a profound definition. So let's go to the next question now. What was the next question on the list? Go to the next question beyond that. When's praise and worship been most meaningful or impactful in your life?
See, there's that question again. I don't know if it's something that was generated by someone who's called in or emailed it in or whatever. But when has praise and worship, here we go again, when they're considered to be synonymous. And we really, really need to work with people to understand, because there's nothing wrong with praise. Praise is wonderful in and of itself. And if, you come into the assembly and what has happened in the assembly has been biblical and meaningful, if you have encountered worship, that's fabulous. If you haven't, because probably it won't be encountered as an assembly. It might be an individual encounter with God. But I don't want people to think that there's anything necessarily that falls short of God's best if we don't achieve the fullness of worship, because I would probably argue that we will not experience the fullness of worship until we stand before Jesus face to face. I mentioned John chapter 9, and in that passage, it's just a fascinating encounter of a man who was blind from birth, abandoned by everybody, his parents. He was expelled from the city, and Jesus heard that he had been thrown out of the city, which was tantamount to an execution. And so he came back to seek him, and he recognized the voice, that voice that had spoken to him at the beginning of that chapter. And so he asks this voice, because he had never seen this man, "Who is he, Lord?" And Jesus said to him, "You're looking at him and you're talking to him." And when that awareness and that gratitude flooded his soul, it says very simply that he worshiped him. It doesn't tell us what he did, but he worshiped him. And I would challenge, and I've done this on a number of occasions over the years, and I remember doing it vividly when I came to Neosho. I said, what are the elements of what you do when you gather in the assembly? And we wrote them all on a board. And there's offering, and there's this, and there's that, and there's this, and there's that. And it says on the marquee that it's morning worship. Okay, so let's take that now into John chapter 9. What did this man do when he stood face to face with Jesus? Did he raise his hands? Did he clap his hands? Did he share testimonies? Did he give him an offering? What did he do? I don't know what he did, but I'll tell you that he did not do most of what we do when we assemble together. Not that what we do when we assemble together, none of it is wrong, but let's not call it and deceive ourselves that it's the fullness of worship, because it's not. It might be the fullness of praise. All of those things are valid and necessary. The fellowship, the different ministries of the church, they're all valid, but they are not necessarily biblical worship. We've talked about it. There are many, many expressions of praise on Thanksgiving. But there is a singular word for worship. Singular word. So it's not as if there are many elements of worship, and I hear it all the time. I go to churches all the time. Well, let's worship the Lord. Raise your hands and worship the Lord. Do this and worship the Lord. They are not necessarily, and of course, can I tell you one other story which is significant because it really impacted my life? When my ministry, it's not my ministry, but you know what I'm saying, started in Buffalo, New York in the fall of 1980. There were very few Southern Baptist vocational worship pastors or praise pastors up in the Northeast. And so I would get called often to speak at conferences. And on my journey, I was just expressing what the Lord had taught me up to that point. And I'll never forget, Ruth and I went to a worship conference in Northern Ohio. Big crowd, probably 200 or 300 people there. I was up on the platform and I was sitting at the grand piano and I was leading in praise, which is normally what I would do in a conference like that. And we were singing. You mentioned I Exalt Thee. Well, there was another song which was very, very common at the time. He is exalted. He is exalted. Remember that? He is exalted on high. And out of the corner of my eye, and it's hard for people to believe, but at the corner of my eye, on the outside of the auditorium, I saw a figure on the outside. I stopped playing. And the people were wondering, and I said, now, I don't know if you're going to believe me, I said, but I think I might have seen the Lord. And I've just had this revelation that we were singing about him, but we weren't singing to him because we were saying he is exalted. So can we do this? I said, can we sing? You are exalted, you are exalted. And let me tell you, Tim, his presence flooded that assembly. Flooded. And it was one of those few times in my life that I believe that we encountered corporate worship. There were tears, there were kneeling, there were people on their faces. And I made a commitment to God. I will never sing about you again. I will always sing to you. And you asked earlier, I don't know if it was before this started, but you were asking about hymns and choruses. I think that one of the fundamental differences is that hymns, by and large, sing about God and sing about Jesus. Very few sing about Holy Spirit. And I think that God revealed to his people, maybe 30 years ago, whenever it was, during those times that the church was evolving, that it was time that we were to sing to him. And as I have led 5 congregations in 40 years into perhaps a more biblical expression of what this thing is all about, that's one of the fundamental things that I've taught, is that we do not sing about Father, Son, and Spirit. We sing to them. It would be so rude if I were encountering you, even though it's by technology, Tim, if I didn't address you in a personal expression, the personal pronoun, but we were using the impersonal pronoun. And let me tell you something that is not found in the English language, but in the Welsh language, there are different words. The word you is expressed as in French, for example. There's a personal expression of you, and there's a familiar expression of you. In Welsh, it's the same. And in the Welsh language, when we refer to Father, Son, and Spirit, we refer to him in the personal, familial expression of that relationship.
They've heard me around here. I mean, our worship guys have all heard me talk about the difference of singing to and singing about. And I don't like us singing songs about God. I don't. It's that's funny that you brought that up too. Again, there's another thing that they may hear me talk about, around here, but it came from, the few years I spent with you, just things you taught me and, those lessons. So let's go back to so let's use the word, talk about praise for a second. So there have been an example of where worship was really an important moment of worship that really impacted you. Was there a moment where just an amazing time of praise impacted you? Because I have one that you were a part of. But do you have one that was just an amazing time of praise really impacted you?
There are many. I don't know. There's one that was a kind of a mountaintop time, but I think that the most profound praise is when people were profoundly grateful and profoundly united. I don't think that there will be biblical praise or biblical worship if there's disunity among the people.
Yep.
And, just to go back to what we were saying about singing to him and not about him. Just several weeks ago, I was involved in a prison ministry, and they gave me some songs that they wanted the prisoners to sing. And one was the familiar hymn, In the Garden. And the thing that's so easy for people to understand is to simply substitute a different pronoun. So instead of saying, and he walked with me and he talked with me, just slow it down a little bit and just say, and you walked with me and you talked with me and you tell me I am your own. And I did that in the prison, and you can't believe how that changed the environment when we were beginning to sing a familiar hymn, but singing it to him and not about him. And those are the moments that I really look back and thank God that I was able to be used to bring a little bit more of this understanding that God really is blessed when we're doing things in a biblical fashion and not in a traditional fashion. Look in the book of Mark and you'll find that Jesus was very opposed to tradition when the traditions of man replaced God's best.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I remember one time, and there's a lot of, we had some good experiences together and things like that. But I remember one time we took our student ministry, went to Dallas, Texas, and you arranged it's kind of a camp for us that year. And we stayed in a church, one location. Actually, we stayed in two churches. One of them was First Baptist Dallas. We spent some time in First Baptist Dallas, which was amazing. Remember, the students got to meet W.A. Criswell, and that was like, gee whiz, that was amazing. But one of the places we went was after we were driving all night long. We went for Christ the Nations Institute, and I remember they just got back from Mardi Gras, and people gotten saved, and they were doing stuff, and they were having, they were doing spiritual warfare on behalf of the new converts, all that kind of stuff. Okay, that was all fine. And we went to I can't remember now the name of it, but their main worship team that did CDs and all kinds of stuff. They had an actual worship session, and we got to be invited into that. Our kids that were a part of that praise team that went with us, and so we're like spectators in their studio, choir room, whatever that's called, and they're practicing, but their practice was real worship. It wasn't what most of the people think about practice being. It was like,
Right.
you know, they're practicing. That's what they're doing. They're rehearsing, but it was legitimate worship.
Right.
And so I remember, you know, so, you know, we believe, you know, the Holy, you know, there's gifts of the Spirit and all these different kind of things. And I teach about that. And so, you know, like a gift of words of knowledge and wisdom, all these kind of things. And I remember staying next to you, and they're in the middle of whatever the song is. It's fever pitch kind of a situation in practice. And the drummer just stops playing. Nobody look. Do you remember this? Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Absolutely.
Nobody, the singers didn't look at him like you were weird. The guitarist didn't look at him like they're weird. The guy that was leading, conducting didn't look like they're weird. I mean, when the drummer stops, it's kind of like, what in the world you doing? You know, nobody did that. The drummer stopped, walked from around the drums, walked directly back to you. Didn't walk around, didn't like look around. We're sitting in a group of people. He walked directly up to you. And I have no idea what I'm standing right next to your left. I'm on your left. And he said whatever he said to you, which I have no idea what it was. And then he turned back around and went back down and got on the drums and kept playing. And I made some kind of like, what was that about? Or whatever you said. I said, and you're like, you know, there is no way in the world that he knew what he just said to me. Like, you know, and I remember those kind of moments that it just, where God showed me examples of how the Holy Spirit operates when you put yourself in a position to allow the Holy Spirit to operate. And if that guy that said, well, I got to finish this song, for heaven's sakes, we're in the middle of a song, I got to finish it. You know, those kind of things have had an impact on me for, you know, all these years later. And I would have not been there if it hadn't been for you having the foresight and the maturity, you know, the knowledge and the relationships to make those kind of things happen, you know. But, you know, I wouldn't say it was the greatest praise event as far as that, but I just remember those are the kind of moments that I remember that I'll never forget that.
Well, biblically, Tim, pretty dramatic things happened a lot in Scripture during
Oh,
the
yeah.
environment of praise.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And while we're on that transition, one of the questions was, I don't know, Adam, you can just scroll down to where it's at, was I talk about how praise is a weapon. All the time, I always am talking about how, you know, praise is the roar of the church and how we can mark our territory with our praise. And I quote, you know, Psalms 8:2, and, you know, how God ordained praise for, you know, because of the enemy to silence. And so one of the questions was, how do we explain as praise as a weapon? And I just have, you know, so whether that's about our, you know, putting on a garment of praise for a spirit of heaviness, whether that's, I remember you're the one who taught me about how it was, or kind of pointed out in Scripture how it was always the worship leaders who led into battle in the Old Testament, you know, whether it's the guys who crossed the Jordan River, you know, the first ones who stepped foot into the flood stage water were the worship leaders, or it's the people going around Jericho, or it's in Jehoshaphat in 2 Corinthians chapter 20, the guy, it was always the worship leaders who led them out into battle, you know. And I've always, so they've heard me say that lots of times in some form about how, you know, one of the ways that we use praise is it's a weapon to silence the enemy, the avenger, and the foe in our lives. So you want to kind of elaborate on that a little bit, or?
Do you remember when we did March for Jesus?
Yep.
It was, I don't know if your people knew about that, but it's strange to me how there were significant things that happened in the body of Christ. Promise keepers, for example. Significant. And yet it went where, I don't know. But there was a thing called March for Jesus. And after I left Missouri and went to Fort Worth, I heard about this March for Jesus thing. Intrigued me, because it was to be a praise march in public. And it was so significant because the very things that I taught about the need for public praise as opposed to private praise. And the other significant thing is that it originated in London. And Graham Kendrick wrote this song which God gave to him, "Shine, Jesus, shine, fill this land with the Father's glory." That was the song that God gave to Graham Kendrick, and it was his heart and his vision that initiated this March for Jesus. And Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister at the time in London, she participated in the first march. And it then became a worldwide phenomenon. I don't know if you remember those days, but we, in the first year that I was in Fort Worth, I said, we need to have a March for Jesus in Fort Worth. So I contacted some congregations and I assembled a group of people who had that same vision. And anyway, the reason why I say this is this, that we had on that, the March for Jesus always followed the National Day of Prayer. So the National Day of Prayer would have been on a Thursday and the March for Jesus was on the following Saturday. 8,000 of us gathered to march through the streets of Fort Worth, and the city closed the center of the city for 1 hour for us to march through the city. We all had different responsibilities as leaders, and my responsibility, among others, was to go to the chief of police to ask him to contribute, cars and so on that would give us security and cordon off streets and so on for the march. Anyway, the march took place on a Saturday. On a Monday, I went back to the city police department, and I went to the chief of police to thank him for graciously closing the streets. And he said, something very strange, he said, we didn't have a single arrest in Fort Wayne this weekend.
Wow. Wow.
Just think of that for a minute. The impact that public praise had in terms of bringing a complete environment in the spirit, which caused that the enemy was totally disabled for those 24, 48 hours in its major metropolitan area. Crazy to think about that, Tim.
Yeah. And I remember you telling me about the Welsh revivals and how they turn, the jails were empty and the police officers turned into bands and, stuff like that because there
were no arrests.
There's no arrests. So,
right.
People hear those stories, they're not true. It's like, we've gotten so far away from, really the, God's way of doing things. And we've substituted it with, man's, kind of the man-made version of, whatever. And it's not the same. And I remember I was probably third grade and they had this new fancy man-made something other. And I got a dress shoe made up for Christmas. Maybe it's Easter, but a holiday, because that's when we got close to my house, holidays. And so I got my shoes and we went to the mall and it was great. And I got my shoes and I went to church the next Sunday and I was telling everybody about this man-made fiber, and the guy took it and he hit the chair with it. And it won't scratch and it won't scuff. And my parents bought it for me. And they had the metal chairs every church had, and so I rear back in my Sunday school class with my other third grade or fourth grade boys, wherever it was. And I was going to show them this fancy shoe I got. And I kicked that chair. And it was two-tone with a high heel on it. And it had dark brown toe and it was light color in the middle, like a tan color, and then dark brown heel. And what ended up happening when I hit that chair on my very first time to wear it was there was a large gap, slice or what you don't call it, that was in my dark brown toe that was now light brown. And I learned that day that man-made does not what they said it was. And God's way of doing things is always better. And that's where our church is where I want us to be, where I want us to keep heading back toward is, it's not about how loud we can sing, but it's not about the technology. It's really about having hearts that are turned toward God and becoming better and better reflections of Him. And like people around here hear me talk about gratitude an awful lot. And you can have this great praise thing. It looks like it's a great praise thing, and everybody's lifting their hands in worship or in praise. But when it's all over, there's no life change taking place because they weren't grateful to begin with. They just loved the songs. But I really believe that gratitude, it's the Philippians chapter 4 passage. We bring all of our stuff to God with a heart of gratitude, and He gives us peace. That's just a different application of it. But I think the root of all these things is gratitude. We come to God with a heart of gratitude, and it's easy to praise God when we're grateful. It's easy to celebrate your football team scoring a touchdown because you're grateful they scored a touchdown. You jump up and holler and scream. Well, when we're grateful to God, it's easy to praise. So I always struggle with people who don't want to praise. Their inhibitions, their flesh, their insecurities, whatever it may be. But I just think that we've become an ungrateful nation. I talk about that sometimes, is how we forget to be grateful. And I think our forgetting to be grateful to God is a great handicap to our praising Him, to our worship, to our obedience, to our surrender, to any of the topics that fall in that category. So one of the things I wanted to kind of surface a little bit while we were talking, I remember, so you came to the church that I was at, we was in Neosho. The very things you're talking about now is things you talk about then, different ways, maybe, but same kind of stuff. I look back on some of the things we saw God do. I remember that one family that you helped, and really it was you. And you really pulled them out of the ditch and set them on a different path, and they got saved, and eventually they went back and did their own thing. They got back on the road again. But I've watched you. You are authentic to what you say. That's not, you're not just reading books and talking stories and saying stuff. The same thing you're saying today in 2020 is the same thing I heard you say in 2080 or 1987. And I said this to you privately the other day, and I would not be who I am without you in my life. And Cross Church would not be who it is without you. Now people who remember you being here and helping, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about who we are based on my leadership and how I lead us to be. We would not be who we are without the seeds and the principles and the time you invested in me, particularly when we didn't have a pastor. I was a kid, and I was like a wild horse, and I was just trying to win kids to Christ, tell people about Jesus. That's all I knew how to do. And, I love God, and I love Jesus and the Bible, and I want people to go to heaven, not hell. And I didn't know much more than that. And I don't know, but on a regular basis, I am profoundly grateful to you. And the difference you made in my life, the way I still hear things like what you've said tonight. I mean, you haven't said anything I haven't heard you say before, and I haven't talked to you until today when I called you. I've not talked to you in a long time. It's not like we hang out all the time, you know. It's just that, you know, God knew what church I need to be at for my first church, and He knew how to orchestrate to make sure you were there. And so, whoever Cross Church becomes in the future, the people we reach, the difference we make in our region, you know, I'm grateful to God, and I want to maintain a heart of gratitude, but I'm also grateful to you. And I know it's all, you know, God, I got you, but I'm grateful for you. And so before we got off the day, I wanted to make sure you knew I was, like you said about praise, you know, if it's done in private, it didn't really count. And I know what you meant by that, but I want everybody that gets to hear this. You know, when your wife gives you a hard time later on, you can just tell her that there's at least one guy out there who loves you, you know? So anyway,
But
if it's
Tim,
okay
I
with
appreciate that. Right time at the right place, right?
you, yeah, right time, right place. God has a way of doing that, doesn't
Yeah, because we came from a tough situation in Buffalo. And Ruth and I talked about it this week. And it's not, I don't believe in coincidence, so it's not coincidental that you called today. But we were talking about the fact that had we not gone through that difficult season in Buffalo, how we would have been robbed of so many wonderful experiences that followed.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of truth to that. God has a way of
Yeah.
doing it. It's crazy how God works those things together for His good. So,
Yeah.
I am grateful for your time tonight as well. And so we're going to get off, but if it's okay with you, I would like, so this is, you know, I'm going to do this every Tuesday night. And so periodically, if it's okay with you, I'd like to have you come back on. We'll talk more
Sure.
about praise and worship. Is that okay with you?
Sure. Yeah.
All
Wonderful.
right. All right.
Love
Anything you
to
want to say to wrap
Kathy.
up?
Well, just love you, love Kathy, love Trevor, love Annie. Haven't seen them for a long time, but I follow you on Facebook, and I really, really appreciate the man you've become.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Well, thank you for watching another Conversations with Tim, and we'll have Hal back on for another conversation soon. Between now and then, be safe, and we'll see you in the neighborhood. Thank you. See you, Hal.
Love you. Bye. Bye.